Well, the officers also described coming upon a scene in which they thought they saw a fellow law enforcement officer, someone in a helmet and a gas mask. But as that person who was standing in front of a car just stood there doing nothing amidst all of the chaos, they realized it was something different completely, and they moved in to arrest James Holmes, who was head to toe in body armor. Officer Grizzle testified that he asked Holmes, "Who's helping you?" Officer Grizzle says Holmes looked at me and smiled. The prosecutor asks, "What kind of smile?" Officer Grizzle answers, "Like a smirk." They have described Holmes during these moments as being very, very relaxed, as being very calm, staring off into the distance and not reacting normally. Shep.
Alicia Acuna at the courthouse Centennial, Colorado this afternoon. Alicia, thank you. So what's this hearing really all about? Judge Andrew Napolitano is with us now. He's our Fox News senior judicial analyst. This isn't the trial. This is
This is a preliminary hearing. I mean, normally the state doesn't want to hold a hearing like this because they basically have to show their cards. They have to put on the stand their witnesses and present their evidence, and the defense can cross-examine it to prove to the judge that they have a case, that they have enough evidence to require the court to summon a jury and to force the defendant to go through a trial. They don't have to prove the case. They have to demonstrate that they have reliable, credible evidence lawfully obtained, which, if believed by a jury, could convict him. Well, why would the state do this, you might ask? Because the state may not want to try this case. The state may want to persuade the defendant and his lawyers that he would be best off pleading guilty and going away for the rest of his life rather than exposing himself to this horrific, horrendous, gut-wrenching testimony and risking being condemned to death.
This is not a matter of anything else, but do you spend the rest of your life in prison or do you get the death penalty? And I guess for the jury, what they have to decide now is what his mental state is, not now, but at the moment he was committing these crimes.
Right. There is no jury in the courtroom. They have not yet been summoned or even called. We don't know who the jurors would be or even if there will be jurors. There's just the judge there. So there's a couple of forces at play here. The defense wants to see how strong the state's case is. The state is happy to let the defense see how strong it is. The state would like the case to be so strong that the defendant doesn't want to go through this again and will plead guilty. The defense lawyers may very well want their own plaintiff to plead guilty because they don't want to go through this. The other way to look at it is, this guy is obviously seriously disturbed. Can a jury even determine whether or not he was of sound mind at the moment he committed these horrific crimes?
It seems almost criminal to even put these families, after all they've been through, to have to hear details that we've not even known.
We have not. You're right, Shep. We have not heard details. What Alicia reported, as precise and compelling as it was, is among the most graphic I have ever heard. You can understand why these cops themselves have broken down as they're describing it. So this is yet another factor at play here. Do you really want to force everybody to go through all of this again, or might it be better for all involved if the person who obviously planned and plotted this and pulled the trigger agreed to go away for the rest of his life?
Well, I guess we can hope there's
this. I think this is the beginning of a long, painful journey for everybody involved in this case.
They've already been through so much.
Yes.
Judge, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, by the way, who needs Congress? House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi wants President Obama to use the 14th Amendment to raise the debt ceiling and dodge a legislative showdown.
If I were president, I would use the 14th Amendment, which says that the debt of the United States will always be paid.
You would just go ahead and do it. You wouldn't wait for the
Congress. I would just go do it, right. But the Congress has incurred much of this debt. And so what he's saying, we incurred it, but we're not going to pay it. If you want to say we're not going to do it so much in the future, well, that's another thing. But you can't say I'm not paying my past debts.
So is that even legal? I'm joined now by Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano. I know this is the kind of stuff that gets your blood boiling.
Yeah, it does get my blood boiling.
Because you're a big defender of the Constitution.
Mrs. Pelosi has essentially taken a small phrase in the 14th Amendment and extrapolated it well beyond its original meaning or even any common sense. The phrase doesn't say the debt of the United States shall not be paid. It shall be paid. It says the debt of the United States shall not be questioned, and it meant shall not be questioned by the states. A little bit of history. Civil War is over. The seceding southern states are brought back into the Union. When they come back into the Union, they have to help pay the federal debt. There was no income tax at the time, so if the federal government needed money, it assessed the states. So some of the debt that they had to help the federal government pay was to pay off the war that was waged against them. So to prevent them from saying, we're not going to pay this debt, why should we pay the bills for the war that was fought against us? The 14th Amendment says, and the debt of the federal government shall not be questioned. It really means questioned by the newly returning southern states. She took that phrase, the debt of the United States shall not be questioned, and somehow claims that that authorizes the president to borrow money on his own.
Have you ever heard anyone use that explanation before?
Yes, I have heard several politicians use that phrase to suggest that the President of the United States can borrow money on his own when it looked like the Congress wasn't going to authorize him to do it. But no president has made that argument. The Congress has raised the debt ceiling, Gretchen, 70 times since 1917. Every single president, from Woodrow Wilson to Barack Obama, recognizes that only the Congress can authorize debt.
Oftentimes, people put out a trial balloon to see how the public reacts to it. Do you think that there was anything to do with Nancy Pelosi saying that on behalf of the president, or just her idea?
I can't get into Mrs. Pelosi's head. The statement was disingenuous, not grounded in history, and betrays an ignorance of the meaning and purpose of the Constitution.
So you don't think it's going to happen?
No, I don't think it will happen. Think about people loaning money to the federal government. They would be hesitant to do so without a promise by the Congress to pay it back. Why the Congress? Because the Constitution says only the Congress can raise money and pay debts. And Mrs. Pelosi should know that.
Okay, and you would know what the Constitution says. Judge, great to see you. Happy New Year.
Good to see you. Happy New Year to you. Welcome back.
Thanks.
Thank you. Or, well, does AIG have a case? Or even a clue? All rise, because the judge is in the House. I'm talking about Fox News senior judicial analyst, the way too thin now, Andrew Napolitano. Judge, a case?
Thank you, Professor Cavuto. I think they have a strong case. I think Maurice Greenberg is right on both counts. First, the bailout was definitely unconstitutional. The government can't pick and choose winners and losers. And secondly, if you're going to bail people out, you have to treat them in a similar way. Here's his argument. 3 people came to the government and bailed us out. Goldman Sachs said, we want $13 billion. The government said, don't worry about it. We'll give some money to AIG, and they'll pay you the $13 billion they owe you, and it looks like it won't come from us. Morgan Stanley went to the government and said, we need some money. And the government said, we'll lend it to you at market rates. AIG went to the government and said, we're dying on the vine. We want to own 80% of you. And when the money comes back, we want 14.5% interest. By the way, we're not charging anybody more than prevailing rates on the interest, but we're going to charge you 3 times what we're paying them. So that constitutes a loss of assets for AIG, which the Fifth Amendment prohibits, and it constitutes disparate treatment. It violates the principle of equal protection, which the Fifth Amendment requires. I think Mr. Greenberg has a very good and a very strong argument to make.
One of the arguments I raised with him when I had him on Fox Business, which, Judge, if you don't get, you should demand, but is that you wouldn't be in a position you are now to sue, to sort of paraphrase a little bit about what Scott was saying. If not for even this clumsy government bailout.
Scott's argument is a good one, and if made by lawyers, it would be called waiver, meaning by accepting the government's offer, by knowing in advance you're going to pay 14%. Correct. It's too late for you to complain now. If you think this offer is too burdensome and violates your rights, you should have thought of it before. That's the argument that government lawyers will make against AIG. Mr. Greenberg's argument is different. He was ousted. He was no longer the chair of AIG at the time. He's saying he's suing just as an ordinary shareholder. He was the biggest non-governmental shareholder of AIG, and he's saying to AIG, the deal you cut with the government cost me hundreds of millions. So you,
well, the government can always say, who cares?
Owe me this money.
The government always say, who cares?
The government, his argument is to the government, you took my profits. You treated me differently than you treated Hank Paulson and others who owned Goldman Sachs stock.
But doesn't this get back to the lunacy of this whole bailout process?
Yes.
That was started on the prior president, by the way.
And in fact,
we went from, too big to fail to too many to not help. And this is the kind of stuff that happens.
In fairness to Greenberg, he says the bailout should never have happened in the first place. He's right. And if his advice had been followed, we wouldn't even be having this conversation because AIG would have gone through bankruptcy and the good parts would have survived and the bad parts would have been sold off. Now we have a mess that's going to end up costing the taxpayers more money than the bailout cost him. That's because George Bush said, in order to save the free market, I have to destroy the free market.
Well, and that's what we did during George Bush's tenure. And I remember I got a lot of grief on this show, and you and I talked about it at that time. At the time, I raised it with the late, great Jack Kemp about the lunacy of starting this whole TARP stuff and these these big bank bailouts. This is from back then in 2008.
The government needs to step in with Treasury to make sure there's a floor under falling real estate values, particularly residential
Why
and
does the
housing
government
values.
need to do that? Why not
Because
let the
very
markets,
frankly,
however hellish it might be, and however hellish it might be tomorrow, Jack, if the House rejects this, let her rip. Why didn't we let her rip?
Because the government decided it could be a sugar daddy. It's interesting, and he was a wonderful and brilliant human being, though we both disagree with him on this. He's talking about the housing market. TARP was originally to preserve housing. The government was going to buy up houses about to be foreclosed.
It went into the auto industry.
Mortgages.
It went into cash for clunkers.
It went everywhere.
It went into educational
but
relief.
Houses.
Exactly.
Right. And now we're paying for it.
Now we're paying for it.
And Maurice Greenberg has got a good case in his hands, and I wish him Godspeed.
All right. And I wish you would eat something. Judge, he is so...
Not Twinkies. They're not around anymore.
No, they're not. But they might be rescued. But I'm going to buy the company myself so that you start eating. For God's sake.
Thank you.
Guilting me out. He looks so great.
Let's talk to the judge about this. This was the end of the preliminary hearing. Senior Judge Andrew Napolitano, our senior judicial analyst, is here. They had said this might take all week, but the defense didn't present anything.
Well, you know, the defense gave an indication that they might present some evidence which would challenge the government's belief that this was planned and plotted methodically by an intelligent person who knew right from wrong, but they decided not to do it. You know, we don't know what's going through the minds of the court or the minds of the prosecutors or the minds of defense counsel at this point, but we do know a couple of things. The principal purpose of a hearing like this is to force the court to evaluate the state's evidence to see if it is competent to convict. It's clear that it is. It's clear that there's enough there to convict. Second purpose of a hearing like this is to show the defendant the volume of evidence against him and say, you really want to go through this in a courtroom? You really want to be exposed to the electric chair? Why don't you plead guilty and we'll let you spend the rest of your life in jail? So we don't know which of the motivations there was there at the time this is being offered. This is the decision of the accused about whether in his counsel. Well, in fairness, now the government has not, as far as we know, this would not happen in public until there's an agreement on it. The government, as far as we know, has not said we offer you life in prison without parole in return for a guilty plea. But one would think in a case like this, where there are so many living victims who would suffer such tremendous trauma at and during the trial, not unlike the case in Arizona with Jared Lee Loughner, where the federal judge was murdered and Congresswoman Giffords was maimed irreparably, that the government would opt for doing away with the trial, forgetting about the death penalty, locking this guy up for the rest of his life. One of the ways of persuading him to go along with that, if it's on the table, is to present this very gruesome, horrific evidence to him in his presence, to his face, which is what they've done in the past 2.5 days.
Alicia, before we get away, Alicia reporting a minute ago from the courthouse that it's the belief of the government and the officers that he wanted to kill everybody in that building. And if it is now his goal to get those who did not die to suffer more, he could go on with this trial and maybe get his wish.
Well, the trial would produce incalculable suffering for the families of the decedents and for the victims who survived, because they'll be testifying in that courtroom. This will go on for months, and then after months of all the bloody, gory testimony, we'll have months of technical testimony with medical experts trying to persuade the jury he knew not right from wrong, he didn't know right from wrong. I'll tell you this, in Colorado, he does not have to prove that he was insane. The government has to prove that he was sane. That's a difficult burden to overcome. They know how to do it. They've done it before, but that makes their case twice as long and twice as expensive when they have that burden to meet.
And probably twice as painful on all those poor people.
Yes, because we'll all be talking about this case for months while the trial is going on.
All right, Judge. Thank you.
Can't we discuss happy things one day?
Yeah, someday, hopefully. Maybe
right,
we'll win the lottery or something.
Vice President Joe Biden continuing his push for more gun control today when he meets now with the NRA and Walmart, the nation's biggest gun seller. So in his meetings yesterday, the vice president said that the president might bypass Congress to make sure new gun laws get enacted.
So can the president actually do that, or is he in jeopardy of violating the Constitution? Joining us right now, Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, what's he talking about?
Well,
executive order.
We think he's talking about something like asking the Environmental Protection Administration to impose a tax on bullets. The city of Chicago attempted to do this, and Rahm Emanuel, of all people, told the city council, this is not going to work. You can't tax something more than the thing itself is worth. They were going to tax bullets that cost about 50 cents each over $5. Now, if they did that, and if we were forced to pay that tax, who would it harm the most? It would harm the poor, people who need guns the most with which to protect themselves because they wouldn't be able to afford the bullets, right. Or it would create an underground market in bullets. Question, can the president impose a tax on his own? Answer, no. The Constitution specifically says only the Congress can tax the people, can raise money, and can spend the money thus raised. Well, okay, but this president has not hesitated in the past to bypass Congress to bring his own personal will into the law, even though Congress is supposed to write the laws.
Why would you make it so complicated? If you were President Obama and you wanted to do this, why would you impose this tax? Why wouldn't you just sign an executive order talking about gun control?
Because he doesn't have the authority to do that. In my view, he doesn't have the authority to impose the tax, though the EPA has done this in the past without congressional authorization. They just announce that they're going to do it. Unless Congress rescinds it, it becomes the law. It's usually sort of a hidden tax that you don't even know you're paying. An example is when you get your oil changed in your car. Without knowing it, you're paying a little bit of a tax collected by the EPA, supposedly going to clean up the earth from oil spills.
You talk about a tax. Why wouldn't he try to say assault weapons upon my signing of this executive order? Banned.
Right. Because only the Congress has the authority to regulate.
So he could just do
I would argue even the Congress doesn't have the authority because the Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms. But put aside these academic arguments, it is clear that the president alone cannot interfere with the right to keep and bear arms, no matter what the tragedy may be, and our heart goes out to all those who were killed and those who survived them, and no matter what the times may demand. Only the Congress can write the laws. The president knows that. The president took an oath to uphold the Constitution. The president taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago Law School. He's still going to try and get around it because he's probably not going to get the restraints on the right to keep and bear arms from the Congress that he'd like.
All right, Judge, thanks so much for that update.
This is a debate that's not going away.
No, it's not. And check out the judge's new column at foxnews.com/opinion. Good to see you.
A California judge today found a 12-year-old boy responsible for killing his neo-Nazi father, dismissing claims the child was acting in self-defense. The father was 32-year-old Jeff Hall. He was asleep, they tell us, when officials say his then 10-year-old shot him at point-blank range. Defense attorneys claim the dad was abusive and violent, and that his son learned it was acceptable to kill people who were a threat. But the judge found the boy knew right from wrong at the time of the shooting. Joining us now is Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, this is a really tough one.
Well, it's always tough when you have facts like this. The father was the stepfather whose political views are, utterly unacceptable and preached violence and apparently caused him to practice violence on the boy at home. But the standard self-defense cases show that you have to be in an immediate threat for the loss of your life in order to justify the use of deadly force. Hardly the case when the father's asleep. So then the fallback defense is the child was so abused, so accustomed to violence, that he thought it was appropriate to strike back. And the testimony just didn't support that because it showed not the need to strike back, but the planning and plotting. So then the third line of defense was, hey, he's 12 years old. He doesn't know right from wrong. This wasn't his real father anyway. And again, the planning and plotting, the judge found, showed that he did know right from wrong. That's the downside. The interesting side of this is because he's 12 and was tried as a juvenile, he cannot be punished beyond age 23.
A 12-year-old boy going to prison for 10 years. I want to give our viewers a little bit of this background. A psychologist called by the defense to testify in the trial said that Hall had been conditioned to violence because of years of physical, emotional, and likely sexual abuse. The final witness to testify for the prosecution, the clinical psychologist, told the court that she interviewed Hall and concluded that he was not a psychopath and that he does understand right from wrong. But his reality, according to everything we got from this court, and really undisputed this part, is this 10-year-old had been beaten and abused and potentially sexually assaulted for years. He learned in school that it was okay to kill if you are being threatened.
Well, there are cases There are decisions that have been upheld by appellate courts which stand for the proposition that the regular, consistent, systematic beating of a person makes violence so normal to them that they're acting out this violence against the person who has inflicted this pain on them can be legally justified, or can diminish the amount of punishment, which is now the next phase. Was he so abused and such a victim that even though what he did was wrong, it's somewhat understandable? Now, he won't go to a prison like you see on television. He'll go to a juvenile detention center. Not a happy place, but not a severely restrictive or horrendous place. Will he be a better person at age 23, or will he be an adult who thinks he can kill and get away with it? That question cannot be answered now, and it's a function of what will happen in his brain in the next 10 years.
You wonder where the system and the family and the support system was and all of that.
He should have been taken away from it. He did not belong in the custody of the stepfather. Quite frankly, no child did, if the evidence that came out of trial was true.
I'm told it's not the stepfather.
Oh, okay.
He killed his father because he thought he was planning to divorce his stepmother. It was his blood father.
Okay, well, the materials we had said that it was the other way around.
It was confusing. Some of the reporting on this was off, and it sounds like maybe you got some of the off.
Yeah.
But still, the little boy went up to him while he's sleeping, put the gun to his head, and blew it away.
Hard to justify that unless you didn't know right from wrong. And the court kept a lot of information from the public. This was a secret trial.
We don't know everything.
Trials for juveniles are kept in secret in order to protect their identity. We don't even know the boy's name.
No, we don't. Don't want to. Rough life ahead.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Judge.
You're welcome, Shep.
Well, the White House has said that it's willing to bypass Congress and use executive orders. In fact, they talked about 19 of them yesterday to enact new gun control laws. But can President Obama really do that while keeping in line with the Second Amendment?
Our very own Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano, challenged that idea, standing with the Constitution, a stance that found him squaring off with the New York Times.
Surprise, surprise.
Well, they're coming after you. Now,
I was surprised when I got up Saturday morning. I knew something had happened because the number of emails vastly exceeded what they normally are at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning, saying, look at the New York Times, look at the New York Times, they're going after you.
Let's see what they said. This is what you said that got them going.
Here's the dirty little secret about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was not written in order to protect your right to shoot deer. It was written to protect your right to shoot tyrants if they take over the government.
Okay, so in response...
That was just a little blurb in the D.C. Bureau for Greta Wire. You know, our colleague Greta Van Susteren has her producer walk around the bureau saying, hey, Eric, you want to say anything for Greta tonight? They found me, and that's what I said. But it was the subject of a piece that I had written for FoxNews.com and the Washington Times that day, last Thursday.
Okay, so explain that then.
Second Amendment was not written to protect the rights of hunters because the people who wrote it already assumed that everybody had the right to hunt because that's the way a lot of them gathered food for their families and for their businesses. But they had just finished fighting a revolution against a tyrant, King George III, and the mightiest army and navy known to the world at the time, that of Great Britain. And the only way they were able to do that was because they had the arms and armaments with which to fight the tyrant. So to make sure that the new government here would not do the same thing to the Americans here that the British had done to the colonists, they made certain that the government would not interfere with our right to protect ourselves. It's another one of those checks and balances. Before somebody in the White House got crazy ideas about taking people's rights, that person had to think twice. These people are not going to go quietly, and they have the means with which to resist. That's the whole purpose behind the Second Amendment. When you hear a politician saying it's for hunting, that's code for, I don't believe in the Second Amendment.
Okay. So the New York Times heard that little clip. It's amazing what they watch, right?
Yes.
And here was the quote that one of their columnists had about you. These extremists, I guess they're talking about you, Judge, make sensible, reasonable gun control hard to discuss, let alone achieve in this country, because they skew the conversations away from common sense solutions on which both rational gun owners and non-gun owners can agree. How do you respond?
Well, look, either we have a Second Amendment or we don't. The whole purpose of the Constitution was to preserve individual rights, whether it's speech, travel, privacy, or self-defense, from the overwhelming passion of the public. Right now, the public is passionate about this because we are still grieving over the horrific massacre, something none of us ever thought we'd see in our lives, that took place in Newtown. So the question is, should law-abiding citizens lose a fundamental liberty because of what some crazies among us have done? We have almost always answered that question, no. We look out for and prosecute the crazies. We don't take the rights away from those who don't abuse them.
And Judge, they took it one step further, the Founding Fathers did when they wrote that Second Amendment. They said the rights shall not, to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed upon. Takes it one step further, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, Eric, and I appreciate you mentioning that. It's really one of the clearest parts of the entire Constitution. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, meaning the government shall not, may not interfere with this. The Supreme Court has said, in your own home, in your backyard, on your property, you have an absolute right to have a weapon.
But real quickly, because we started the segment saying that the president talked about possibly 19 executive orders, people have disagreed with me on this show that he has the ability to do that, but now they're saying 19 executive orders. What can he do?
Well, we need to see them. We need to see exactly what he's going to do.
They would probably be limited in scope.
Well, technically, theoretically, if it's done according to law, an executive order regulates the federal government's administration of the law. So it can't target any individual. It can target the way the feds administer the law. So he could say to the DEA, I want you to start harassing gun dealers, make it more difficult for them to import or to transport guns. One of the worst things he might do that's being discussed is he could say to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Administration, there's lead in bullets. Let's start charging people more for the bullets because lead impairs the atmosphere. They actually tried that in Chicago, and it was defeated. So once we see that list, we'll know whether or not the president and this administration are faithful to their oaths, their solemn oaths to uphold the Constitution, which includes the Second Amendment.
All right, Judge Andrew Napolitano, who is now in a tiff with the Times. Judge, thank you very much for dropping by.
Well, as Wendell just mentioned, there are published reports out today that the president's gun control plans include some 19 executive orders that will work around the edges of, we're not sure, some of the nation's current gun rules on background checks and a number of other issues. Will they supplement them? Will they clarify them? We have to wait to find out. And as Jay Carney just mentioned, the administration says it knows that there are limits to what the president can do. Joining us now, Judge Andrew Napolitano, a Fox News senior judicial analyst. The president needs to be careful. This is not some statute he's messing with. It's the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, right there in the Bill of Rights, which was intended to keep government away from our guns and to stop it from messing with people's right to bear arms. However, it's not absolute. Gun legislation has been passed in the past, and presidents, including a Republican president, George H.W. Bush, have issued executive orders tightening the gun control restrictions.
Yes.
So how far can President Obama go?
Well, it's a great question, Megan. The statute on which President George H.W. Bush relied said that the president could ban importation into the U.S. of weapons that were not, quote, suitable for sporting purposes, closed quote. And then it left up to the president and his advisors to determine what that means, suitable for sporting purposes. George H.W. Bush, himself a hunter, and throughout his career, candidly, a defender of Second Amendment rights, tightened up the meaning of suitable for sporting purposes so as to exclude from lawful importing in the U.S. You could own it in the U.S. if you somehow got it. But if you're a dealer, you couldn't bring it here. If you're a seller in another country, you couldn't sell it to someone in the U.S. Guns that he was able to determine had purposes other than sporting. This is an example of an area of governmental authority where the president has discretion. President Obama, that law, by the way, is a 1968 statute from the LBJ years, and it's still on the books. President Obama could, if he wanted to, without violating the law, redefine that even tighter than President George H.W. Bush has. It hasn't been touched since he was president in 1989, I believe.
Yeah.
So that's an area he could lawfully go to.
What else could he do? Because what we're hearing sounds, I mean, not like he's not going to go to the third rail, but I don't know. We're talking 19 orders. I'm hearing reports about 3 possible orders, including possibly giving the Centers for Disease Control authority to conduct national research on guns. I mean, so they're going to go research it.
Okay.
More aggressive enforcement of existing gun laws. The president controls enforcement through the FBI, through the DOJ.
Right.
And through the ATF. Pushing for wider sharing of existing gun databases among federal and state agencies. Do any of those jump out at you?
Well, no. Those things would be lawful for the president to do, and they actually regulate the government. They tell people in the executive branch of the government how the chief executive officer, the president, wants laws to be enforced. Now, for example, the DEA regulates gun dealers. They look at the records of gun dealers once every 6 months. The president could have them look at the records of gun dealers once every month, once every week. It would be very expensive for them to do it, but if they did, it would slow down the process of their selling guns because they'd be spending a great deal of their time dealing with DEA agents who were poring over their records. Some people would say, well, that's harassment. Other people would say that's law enforcement. That is within the president's prerogative. An interesting idea that was floated by Rahm Emanuel, the current mayor of Chicago and the president's former chief of staff, would be for the president to ask the Environmental Protection Administration to use its regulatory authority to impose a fee on manufacturers of ammunition. The theory being ammo is made out of lead. Lead bullets eventually end up in the earth. The dirt around the lead has to be cleaned up, and therefore the government, which does much of the cleaning, needs to be reimbursed.
Oh, boy.
Pass that tax along, and it will double the cost of bullets, and that will deter people from buying bullets because they can't afford them, or it will force people into buying black market bullets that don't have that tax.
Could he get away? That seems a bit tenuous in terms of,
Yes.
federal powers, but
Yes.
you tell me.
I think it is tenuous. I think it would be unconstitutional and unlawful. I think that a court would interfere with it. But remember, Megan, we are not dealing with a fair-minded person attempting to resolve a problem of paramount public importance. We are dealing with a mindset that is profoundly against the Second Amendment and will push its ability to infringe upon the right to keep and bear arms to the constitutional limits.
He claims he's not. He gave that famous speech in which he said, I'm not going to come after your guns. I believe in some reasonable gun control measures, but I'm not going to come after your guns. And, if you look at his first term, Judge, he didn't do anything to crack down on guns.
You're right. We'll see what he does tomorrow. He's confronted with a Senate that his party controls, but there are many Democrats in that Senate who are in favor of the Second Amendment, and he's confronted with a House of Representatives with noticeable antipathy towards him on almost everything and is profoundly in favor of the Second Amendment. We'll see how far he can go. But even in his press conference earlier this week, Megan, you and I talked about this, he indicated a willingness to do whatever it takes to raise the debt ceiling, whether Congress goes along with it, and now to keep guns out of the hands of people that he doesn't want them to have, even though this is not a federal function, and even though he can't change any laws without Congress.
That's the thing, is that the executive orders are not to be used to change the law or to get around Congress's unwillingness to pass a law. And that's why we have separation of powers. So you can't go too far with it. If you want to clarify, further enforcement, sort of assist an existing law, that's one thing. If you try to do an end around or just create an order that is a law that could not get passed, then you're on dangerous ground, right?
Exactly. I'll give you two examples we all know about. When Harry Truman became president, he signed an executive order desegregating the military and the civilian workforce in the federal government. Great thing to do. Then he issued an executive order seizing the steel mills so that he could have all the steel he needed for the Korean War. The Supreme Court said you can do the first one, you can't do the second one. The first one complements the Constitution and existing laws. The second one interferes with freedom of commerce.
Judge, great to have you. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure, Megan.
A Wyoming sheriff is now saying that he will ignore any of the White House's new gun control recommendations that his department finds unconstitutional. President Obama is set to make that announcement about an hour from now. But this sheriff is not alone. At least 6 states say that they are seriously considering taking some sort of legislative action against the government. Those states include Alabama, Missouri, Montana, South Carolina, Texas, and Wyoming. Meanwhile, many sheriffs, like the one in Wyoming, are calling also for action. Judge Andrew Napolitano, senior judicial analyst here at Fox and good friend of America's Newsroom. Good to see you this morning. Good morning, Judge.
Good to be with you, Martha. And Bill, with his wisecracks over there.
I'm good for that.
Can they do this?
Yes. This is an interesting area of law enforcement. Everybody in law enforcement and the judiciary takes the same oath. I took the oath. It's to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Implicit in that oath is a judgment that each individual makes. Is this order that my superiors have given me? Is this request that my colleagues have asked of me? Is this application that lawyers have made before me consistent with the Constitution? Normally, there is tremendous cooperation between state and local law enforcement on one hand and the feds on the other. And that's for a variety of reasons. They help each other. Sometimes the state has to call in the feds, and the feds have something the states don't, a big fat checkbook. So the feds fund a lot of local law enforcement. But occasionally the feds will ask state and local law enforcement to do something they don't want to do. It might be against local law or a state law. For example, in Colorado and in the state of Washington today, local law enforcement cannot enforce federal laws against marijuana because marijuana is permissible under state law. That's a direct clash, a direct conflict. In this particular case with this sheriff, he is, I think, accurately anticipating that the president will seek legislation and sign executive orders that will infringe upon the right to keep and bear arms. Is it a crime for him to refuse to cooperate with the feds? Absolutely not. Does he have the discretion, the lawful ability to refuse to cooperate with the feds? Yes, he does. This is actually a growing movement throughout the country. Local and state law enforcement saying to the feds, those are your laws, you enforce them.
Fair. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, when you look at an executive order, I think most people would assume that that's an executive order, that has to be carried out across all levels of law enforcement in the country. But let's talk about it on a practical matter in terms of how it might manifest itself, because we are expecting that the president will put in this proposal limits on multiple clips, limits on certain kinds of weapons, automatic weapons. How will that manifest itself in terms of how these sheriffs
those limitations, like on the size of the weapons, the power of the weapons, the amount of bullets that a clip can hold, can only be legislated by the Congress. The president can't do that. And the president's executive orders can only apply to people that work for him, employees of the federal government. Harry Truman, when he became president, was scandalized to learn that the federal government was segregated, the military and the civilian workforce. With an executive order, he stopped the segregation by race. The president has the power to do that. Could he have desegregated state governments? No, he didn't have the authority. Now the president does because of civil rights laws happily enacted since then. So the president of the United States cannot tell a local sheriff, a local police officer, a state attorney general what to do. He can only tell federal law enforcement what to do. But that's a big stick because they sometimes show up with a checkbook. And that's a great inducement to comply with what the feds want when they're going to let you hire X number more police and they're going to pay for it. Where this goes, I don't know.
Purse strings are very powerful.
Purse strings are very powerful. I commend, I applaud local law enforcement when they say to the feds, don't come here. This is our problem, and we'll deal with it. The Constitution means what it says right here.
Fascinating constitutional debate, and I know that you're somewhat interested in those. Judge, thank you so much.
I'm hung up on this Constitution thing.
We love that about you.
All right.
We'll see you soon. Thank you, Judge.
The widow of a movie massacre victim is now suing the former psychiatrist of the shooting suspect, James Holmes. The widow says she is suing the psychiatrist because she, quote, knew that James Holmes was dangerous, end quote, after he reportedly told her in June that he wanted to kill. Court documents say the psychiatrist did tell a campus threat assessment team about her concerns, but turned down a police officer's offer to arrest James Holmes and put him under a 72-hour psychiatric hold. The widow is also suing the University of Colorado. A university spokesman says, quote, the university believes the lawsuit is not well-founded legally or factually. Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano joins us now. Judge, great to see you.
Good to see you,
Is this legally founded?
I don't know if it's factually founded. A jury will decide what the facts are, but it is legally frivolous to sue a psychiatrist in Colorado, indeed in most states, because the psychiatrist declined to permit the police to arrest her patient. Now, this is the way it works. The police gather some information from some source, which causes them to believe that the patient is an immediate threat to his own life or the life of others. So they go to the patient's psychiatrist saying, well, you signed this affidavit in which we'll ask a judge for authority to arrest him. If the psychiatrist says yes, they then need another psychiatrist, you have to have two, to sign a similar affidavit, and then they can arrest him, and he can be, not for a crime, but because he's dangerous to himself and others, and then he can be examined by other psychiatrists for 3 days, and the judge decides whether to let him go or keep him confined. Just because the first psychiatrist said no was not a reason for the police to stop asking. Flip side of this is the professional judgment of a doctor about whether or not the doctor's patient should be incarcerated is protected from liability as long as it was a professional judgment, as long as she didn't make that judgment for some venal or malicious purpose. But if she honestly thought he wasn't a danger to himself and others, even though that judgment was wrong, she can't be sued for it.
But what if, is there a buck stop here mentality in the law, Judge, that maybe a different judge says, you know what, we know he told her that he had fantasies of killing a lot of people and that she should have done more, and that maybe a judge makes an example of this psychiatrist?
Yes. Yes, Trace, I'm sure that is a great question, my dear friend. That is probably the goal of the lawyers. Sometimes the laws are changed by judges allowing lawsuits which appear to be inappropriate under the present state of the law in response to a public crisis. So if, for example, the judge allows the case to go through and the jury finds the physician liable, that might change the law in Colorado. My judgment is most judges would not let this case go through because Colorado law is pretty clear on this. You don't go after the doctor as long as the doctor's judgment was a professional one and not a personal or malicious one.
Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, great to see you. Thank you,
Good to see you, my friend.
Did you see this last night? Senator Marco Rubio says the president's gun control proposal is proof that he does not believe in the Second Amendment.
I actually think the president, and he just doesn't have the guts to admit it, is not a believer in the Second Amendment, although he states that he is. If he doesn't want the Second Amendment to be in the Constitution, or if he wants to reform the Second Amendment, then have the guts to admit that.
Here to weigh in, Fox News senior judicial analyst and part of the People Group, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Do you believe? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I say that Senator Rubio has the political courage, in my view, to put his finger right directly on the problem that we confront.
Which is?
And I applaud him and agree with him, which is that the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, their entire administration, the people that brought us Obamacare, do not believe in parts of the Constitution. They don't believe in the 10th Amendment that reserves powers to the states, and they don't believe in the Second Amendment that guarantees us the right to keep and bear arms. And they will do everything they can to wear away at those parts of the Constitution with which they disagree. Remember, when they started their jobs, they took an oath to uphold the Constitution, all of it, whether they agree with it or not.
So some people would say that that's an extremist point of view, that the President of the United States does not believe in the Second Amendment and actually wants to abolish it or get rid of it. How do you defend yourself on that?
Well, he signed 23 executive orders yesterday with children as props. Another issue for another time, the propriety and wisdom of that. Each one of those enhances the authority of people in the government who work for him to intrude into the privacy rights of people who keep and bear arms. We saw a massive intrusion into those privacy rights 3 weeks ago when a crazy newspaper publisher north of New York City decided to publish the names and addresses of people who lawfully are authorized to own guns.
Right.
The president yesterday, among the many executive orders he signed one saying, nothing in the health care law shall prevent physicians from asking their patients if they own guns. What business is it of a physician if a patient owns the gun? Why should the president be getting involved in this? And when he says nothing shall prohibit, the next step is physicians shall ask and report. Because remember, whatever physicians say now in this modern Obamacare era, I'm going like this because they have to use laptops, the government gets to hear about.
What about if the patient, though, has mental illness?
It is not the job of a physician to decide whether his or her patient is qualified to own a gun. A lot of people have mental illnesses. Not all mental illnesses are gun disqualifying. Not all mental illnesses are obvious. Not all people go to physicians for mental illnesses. Does the president, this is back to Senator Rubio, does the president dislike the Second Amendment so much that he wants to deputize physicians to put their noses in their patients' businesses about how they protect themselves. All of this is an example of an administration determined to infringe upon the right to keep and bear arms. That's why this great national debate that we're having, the country's ablaze with debate about firearms. Yeah. We cannot let them do that.
All right. Amazing and interesting discussion. Judge Andrew Napolitano, always great to see you. Thanks.
Pleasure. Now, where's Brian and his people?
I don't know. He's coming up.
Meantime, call it a code cash. The nation's biggest health insurer warning today about the health care law. United Healthcare says that its costs are running up. All rise. The judge says your premiums are about to do the exact same thing. Judge, what do you make of that? I guess we shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, well,
premiums will likely go up.
No, of course premiums are going to go up because the government's hand is on the scale of what was left of the free market in health care. When Obamacare became law and the Supreme Court, through a cockamamie line of reasoning, said it's valid and consistent with the Constitution.
That was your darkest day.
It was one of my darkest days here. Boy, was I wrong in my predictions.
Shaking the Constitution.
Right, right. But when it became law, and when this portion I'll now discuss kicks in, the health insurers have to spend between 80 and 85% of collected premium revenues directly on health care. They can't use it for any other purpose. They can't use it for investment. They have to have investments because they never know when they're going to be hit with a heavy number. And they can't use it for management. It has to go directly into health care. This represents a political number. Where did 80 to 85% come from? This is not based on the experience of the health care providers or the insurance carriers. This is based on what Congress agreed to politically. It also represents government interfering with the free market. So think about it. If you knew your costs were going to go up and your prices were going to be capped, but they weren't capped yet, nature would raise those prices now so that you had a well from which to draw when the costs go up. Precisely. Right. And this underscores Ms. Schakowsky's misunderstanding of all this. The price rise is caused by the government's soon-to-be lawful caps on
You get in there
expenses.
while the getting's good.
Precisely.
You hike ahead of the hit.
So nobody should be surprised when we all pay higher premiums.
All right, Judge, thank you very, very much.